and the manifold sorts of trash which they had eaten upon the voyage. And when they did finally get to the city of Panama, they were, quite justifiably, hangry. And so instead of just the usual plundering of the city, they were brutal to the inhabitants, torturing and killing most of them, and eventually Morgan burned the entire city to the ground. This was the event that turned Henry Morgan from privateer to pirate, a man outside the law. Though when Exquemelin's book came out years later, Henry Morgan actually denied many of the worst atrocities of this period and of the entire book, like the claim that he'd ordered captive monks and nuns to be used as human shields during the siege of Portobello. And he even brought a successful libel suit against the publisher. In his affidavit, he swore that he had against evil deeds, piracies, and robberies the greatest abhorrence and distrust, and that he always had and still has hatred for the kind of men called buccaneers, though he made no denial of eating leather. And this was not the only time that people have been reduced to eating leather to survive. One of the oldest stories I could find came from the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD. As the Romans surrounded the city, for those inside the walls, their hunger was so intolerable that it obliged them to chew everything, such things as the most sordid animals would not touch, and endured to eat them. Nor did they at length abstain from girdles and shoes, and the very leather which belonged to their shields they pulled off and gnawed. Tales of another leathery meal appeared in the newspapers of London in July of 1759. The Gentleman's Magazine printed an account of the sufferings of Captain Barron and his crew in the Dolphin sloop, bound for the Canaries to New York. Shortly after leaving the Canary Islands, they ran into some horrible weather, which damaged the ship, and they lost their bearings, and so they were at sea for nearly 6 months, which was a lot longer than the 6 weeks they had planned for. The captain said they had not had any ship provisions for upwards of 3 months, that they had eaten their dog, their cat, and all their shoes, and, in short, everything that was edible on board. It was still weeks before they would be rescued, and so the men aboard the Dolphin turned to cannibalism. They all agreed to cast lots for their lives, which accordingly they did. The shortest lot was to die, the next shortest to be executioner. The man who drew the lot was a Spanish passenger, the only man on board who wasn't part of the crew. And all those on board did as they had planned. But just a few weeks later, the captain saw they were casting lots a second time. But it happened very luckily that he bethought himself of a pair of breeches that were lined with leather. He soon found them, took out the lining, and cut off for each man's share a piece of about 1.5 inches square for the day's allowance. That, with the grass which grew upon the deck, was all the support they had for about 20 days before they were taken up. A similar situation befell the Arctic explorer Captain John Franklin. In 1819, he led 20 men through the Canadian tundra from Hudson Bay to the mouth of the Coppermine River. And during the 2-year expedition, they often found themselves running out of rations before they got to their next outpost, and so they would look to their shoes. After halting an hour, during which we refreshed ourselves with eating our old shoes and a few scraps of leather, we set forward. Some hours later, they stopped again and supped upon tripe de roche. And while that sounds like a fancy French meal of animal tripe, it was actually a type of lichen that grew on rocks, and they lived on that for much of the next few weeks. But the tripe de roche, even where we got enough, only served to allay the pangs of hunger for a short time. This unpalatable weed was now quite nauseous to the whole party, and in several it produced bowel complaints. Mr. Hood was the greatest sufferer from this cause. I have to say, if I was Mr. Hood, I'd be kind of annoyed at this. We go through this harrowing experience together. Over half of us die along the way, and when you write it down for posterity, you have to include stuff about my bowel movements? Not cool, dude. Not cool. But fortunately for Mr. Hood, history would not dwell upon his collywobbles, but rather the leather eating. For upon their return, the